The storage bay on Outpost Nuren smelled like cold metal and old chemicals. Roan Decker did not mind. He had been working in places like this for 7 years, low-lit, forgotten rooms at the edge of space where nobody important ever came. That was fine with him. Important people brought problems. Quiet rooms brought work. He was cataloging a tray of mineral samples collected from the gas giant below when he heard it. A small scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the floor behind the large ventilation unit in the corner. Roan set down his tool and listened. It came again, slow, uneven. He picked up his handheld light and walked over. He moved the way he always moved around unknown things, carefully, without sudden motion. He had worked with enough alien fauna to know that fast movement near a frightened creature was a good way to lose a finger. He crouched and shone the light behind the ventilation unit. A pair of eyes looked back at him. They were gold, bright and sharp the way only young eyes are. The creature was small enough that Roan could have held it in both hands. Its scales were a deep blue-green but looked wrong somehow, dull and patchy the way a plant looks when it has not had water. One of its front limbs was tucked close to its body. In the other, it held something. A crystal shard, pale and faintly glowing, roughly the size of a large finger, and cracked clean through the middle. Roan had no idea what species he was looking at. His database covered 43 known alien fauna categories. He ran through them quickly in his head and came up empty. But he knew one thing without needing a database. The creature was hurt and it was scared. He turned his light slightly away so it was not shining directly into those gold eyes. Then he did the thing he had done since he was a boy on Earth whenever something small and frightened crossed his path. He held out his open hand, palm up, still, waiting. The creature growled. It was a tiny sound, more air than threat. Roan did not move. The creature growled again. Then it stopped. It tilted its small head at his open hand the way a curious animal does when something does not match what it expected. It had probably expected him to grab at it or step back. He had done neither. 1 slow minute passed. Then it moved forward and climbed into his palm. It was lighter than it looked. Roan felt the faint warmth of its body, the grip of small claws that were careful not to press too hard. It settled into his hand and looked up at him, still holding the cracked crystal shard tight against its chest. Roan looked at the shard more closely. Even cracked, it gave off a faint hum he could feel more than hear, a low vibration that moved up through his palm. Whatever it was, the creature was not letting go of it. He did not try to take it. He stood up slowly and carried the creature back to his work table. Under proper light, it looked even worse. 2 of its scale patches along its left side were gray and lifeless. The tucked limb had a shallow cut across the joint, and the crystal, now that he could see it clearly, was not just cracked. It was fractured in 3 places, held together by almost nothing. The glow inside it was uneven, pulsing weakly the way a signal does when it is almost lost. Roan opened his research terminal and started searching. It took him 20 minutes of cross-referencing before he found a partial match buried in a xenobiology archive that was 11 years old and poorly updated. The species was listed as Vraxi, native to a cluster of hot worlds near the border of contested space. Almost no field data. One note at the bottom of the file, added by some researcher who sounded like they had been frightened when they wrote it. Do not approach Vraxi in the wild. Extremely territorial, queen-bonded species. Hatchlings are never found alone. Roan read that last line again. Hatchlings are never found alone. He looked at the small creature on his table. It had curled up around the cracked shard and was watching him with those gold eyes, exhausted but alert. He thought about what that meant. A hatchling, alone, on a research station in neutral space, holding a broken crystal that was clearly important to it. He did not know what the crystal was for yet, but he knew what broken things looked like when they mattered. He pulled his xenomaterial repair kit from the lower drawer and set it on the table. The hatchling watched him, "All right," Roan said quietly, more to himself than to it. "Let's see what we can do." He did not file a report that night. He did not call Commander Yult. He did not ping his research partner Das. He just sat down under the worktable light and started looking at a broken crystal, while a small creature with dull scales and gold eyes watched him work. Outside the station, the gas giant turned slowly in the dark. 3 star systems away, in a place Roan had never been and could not have found on a map, something ancient and vast stirred. And through a bond that should have been silent, a faint signal had just come back to life. The repair kit was not made for this. Roan knew that from the first minute. The tools were built for xenomineral samples and synthetic composites, not for something that hummed and pulsed and seemed almost alive in the way a machine cannot be. But he had nothing else, so he worked with what he had. He started by examining the fractures under his magnifier. 3 cracks. The largest ran almost the full length of the shard, splitting its core. The other 2 branched off it like rivers breaking apart before they reached the sea. The light inside the crystal moved through the undamaged sections and stopped dead at each fracture point, bleeding out into the air instead of continuing through. It reminded him of a broken fiber optic cable, light that had somewhere to go but could not get there anymore. He worked slowly. He used a micro-adhesive designed for crystalline minerals and applied it in thin layers along the smallest fracture first, letting each layer set before adding the next. The hatchling sat at the far edge of the table and watched him. It had stopped growling. It had not stopped holding the shard. Roan had to carefully work around the small claws each time he repositioned it. He did not pull it away. He just worked with it there, held gently, as if the creature understood that letting go for even a moment was not possible. An hour passed, then 2. Roan's back ached from leaning over the magnifier. He straightened up once, rolled his shoulders, drank cold coffee and went back to it. The second fracture took longer. The crystal material near it had micro-shattered, tiny fragments that needed to be coaxed back into position before the adhesive could hold them. He worked with a tool finer than a human hair and tried not to breathe too hard. 3 times he almost lost a fragment. 3 times he caught it. By the time he reached the main fracture, the long one, it was past 3 in the morning station time. The hatchling had not moved. Its gold eyes tracked every motion of his hands with the focused attention of something that understood on some level what he was trying to do. The main fracture required a different approach. The adhesive alone would not hold under the stress of whatever energy was running through the crystal. Roan thought about it for 10 minutes, staring at the crack. Then he used a mineral resin compound meant for stabilizing geological samples, applying it in a thin brace along the fracture's length before sealing it with the adhesive over the top. It was not elegant. A proper crystallographer would have found it rough, but it would hold. He leaned back and looked at the repaired shard. It still had lines where the fractures had been. They would always be there. But under the magnifier, the interior light was moving again, slowly at first, then with more purpose, flowing through the repaired channels and continuing all the way through. The pulse was still uneven, but it was whole. Roan picked it up carefully and turned to the hatchling. The small creature had gone very still. Its gold eyes were fixed on the shard. It looked the way animals look right before something overwhelms them, tense and waiting and not breathing. Roan held the shard out toward it. The hatchling reached out and took it back into its claws. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the scales lit up. It was not a bright flash. It was a slow bloom like light coming on behind a curtain. The dull gray patches along its side filled with color first. Blue-green, deep and rich, spreading outward from where it held the shard until the creature's entire body was glowing faintly in the dark of the lab. It made a sound Roan had not heard from it before. Not a growl, something quieter, something that sounded like relief in any language. Roan sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. He did not know, at that moment, what he had actually done. He did not know that the shard was a bond crystal, a Vraxi hatchling's link to its queen, cut off from her signal for what must have been days. He did not know that a repaired bond crystal does not just restore the link. It broadcasts it, sends a pulse back along a connection that had gone silent, and announces itself like a door swinging open. He did not know that 3 star systems away, a very large and very old creature had just felt something it had given up for lost. He just knew the small creature on his table looked better. That was enough. The sound of the lab door opening made him turn around. Das stood in the doorway in his off-duty clothes, holding a drink and looking half asleep. The Galric alien had 4 pale eyes, and they were all open wide now, staring at the glowing hatchling on the table. The drink hit the floor. "Roan," Das said, in a voice that was very careful and very quiet. "That is a Vraxi hatchling." "I know," Roan said. "On your table." "I know. Glowing. I fixed its crystal." Das stared at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the hatchling. The hatchling looked back at him with gold eyes and made a small sound. Das turned around and walked back out of the lab. Roan looked at the hatchling. The hatchling looked at Roan. Its scales were still glowing softly, the light pulsing in slow, steady time with the crystal in its claws. He reached over and turned off the overhead light, leaving just the glow of the shard and the hatchling in the dark. Then he pulled his chair closer to the table, crossed his arms, and closed his eyes for a few hours of sleep. He had no idea what was already moving toward him through the dark between stars. Roan found out how Civ had gotten onto the station by accident. He was searching the cargo manifests from the last 3 trade ships and found a note buried in a secondary log. A brief temperature anomaly recorded in a sealed crate of raw mineral ore from the border region. Small enough to be ignored. Exactly the size of a hatchling curled tight and still for 2 days of transit. He named her Civ because she needed a name, and he was not good at leaving things unnamed. She had been on the station for at least 3 days before he found her. Long enough to be hungry, dehydrated, and dragging a cracked crystal through service corridors looking for something she could not find. He was trying to work out what she had been looking for when the station's proximity alert went off. The alert sound on Outpost Nuren was a low, repeating tone, not aggressive, designed for a research station where alarms were usually about equipment and not threats. It sounded 3 times before Roan registered it. He looked up at the ceiling out of habit, then at his terminal, which was already showing the outer sensor feed. 3 ships had dropped out of fold space at the outer marker. They were big. Not cargo big, warship big, with the angular silhouettes and heat signatures that did not belong anywhere near a neutral research post. The station's identification system worked for 4 seconds and then returned a single designation that made the alert tone feel very inadequate. Vraxi Dominion, military class, all 3. Civ, curled on the heated sample tray, lifted her head and went still. Roan stared at the screen. The ships were not moving. They were just sitting there at the outer marker, which was both less frightening and more frightening than if they had come in fast. His comm unit buzzed, then buzzed again. Then Das's voice came through higher than usual. "Roan, station channel now." He switched to the main channel. Commander Yult's voice was measured in the way that people are measured when they are working very hard at it. "Attention all station personnel. We have 3 unscheduled vessels at the outer marker. Vraxi Registry. We are attempting contact. All non-essential movement between decks is suspended until further notice." Then, after a pause that lasted too long, "If anyone has information relevant to this situation, report to command immediately." Das appeared in the lab doorway 30 seconds later, looking at Roan with the expression of someone who had been awake for too long and was now facing something that sleep would not fix. "You need to take her to command," Das said. Roan looked at Civ. She was pressed flat against the sample tray, scales dimmed, eyes on the door. She was scared. "She's not well enough to be transferred," Roan said. Roan, those are Vraxi warships. I know what they are. Then you understand that the fastest way to make this situation not our problem is to hand her over and let them leave. Roan looked at his partner for a moment. Das was not cruel. He was just practical in the way that small creatures become practical when they live near large, dangerous things, minimize contact, give ground, stay alive. It was a reasonable way to live. She was alone in a cargo crate for 2 days, Roan said. Her bond crystal was cracked. Whatever happened to her before she got here, she was not safe. I'm not putting her in a transfer box and sending her out there until I know she's stable. Das opened his mouth and then closed it. He looked at Civ. Civ looked back at him with large gold eyes. He made a sound that had no translation and left. Roan opened his station comm and called command himself. He told Yult what he had. He told him the hatchling was in his care, that she was recovering, and that he was not prepared to rush a transfer that could harm her. Yult's response was quiet and precise. Roan, I want you to understand the position this puts the station in. I understand it, Roan said. She's still not well enough. A pause, then I'll be in touch. The 3 warships did not move for 6 hours. They did not respond to the station's hails. They did not advance. They sat at the outer marker like something waiting for a sign. Roan fed Civ from the emergency protein stores in his kit, which she ate with the focused intensity of something that had been very hungry for a long time. Her scales had brightened since the previous night. The gray patches were almost gone. She moved her previously tucked limb without guarding it now. She was healing. He was running a new scan on the bond crystal, trying to understand its structure better, when the comm unit buzzed again. Not Yult this time. A station-wide broadcast, routed through the external channel. Yult's voice, all personnel, we have received a direct transmission request from the Vraxi formation. This is not coming from the warships. A pause. It is coming from a 4th vessel that just entered sensor range behind them. We are attempting to classify it. The transmission request is addressed specifically to Roan Decker, Xenobiology Division, Lower Research Deck. The lab went very quiet. Civ lifted her head from the tray and looked at Roan. The crystal in her claws pulsed once, slow, bright, and deliberate. Roan looked at the comm unit, then at Civ, then at the ceiling, as if the answer to what he was supposed to do now might be written up there somewhere. It was not. He reached out and accepted the transmission. The screen on Roan's wall terminal flickered once, and then resolved into something that filled the entire frame. She was not what he expected, though he could not have said what he expected. The Vraxi database entry had no images of a queen. It had only that one line of warning at the bottom, written by someone who had clearly been in a hurry to write it and a greater hurry to leave. Queen Vara was enormous. Even through the screen it was clear she was in a space built to fit her, and it was still barely enough room. Her scales were deep black with a faint red sheen along the ridgeline, the color of cooling metal. Her face was long and scarred, not from carelessness, but the kind of scarring that accumulates over a very long life of being at the center of things that leave marks. Her eyes were the same gold as Civ's, but where Civ's eyes were bright and curious and young, Vara's were still. The way deep water is still. She did not speak immediately. She looked at Roan. Roan did not look away. He had learned a long time ago, from his first field season working around large predatory fauna, that looking away was the wrong instinct. Not because it showed weakness, though some species did read it that way, but because looking away meant you stopped seeing what was in front of you. And right now, what was in front of him was the most important thing in the room. On the sample tray beside him, Civ had gone completely still. Her eyes were fixed on the screen. Her scales cycled through colors the way they did when she was feeling something large. Vara's gaze moved from Roan to Civ. Something changed in that ancient face. Not softening exactly, more like a door opened slightly in a wall that had no other openings. Then she looked back at Roan. "You are the one." Her voice came through the translator with a slight delay, the words arriving just after the movement of her jaw. The translator had clearly done its best and was not entirely confident. "The hands that touched the shard." It was not a question. Roan answered it anyway. "Yes," he said. "You repaired it." "I tried to. It is not a perfect repair." Vara was quiet for a moment. "I am aware of what it is. I felt it when the bond returned. I know what your work looks like from the inside of the crystal." She paused. "It will hold for decades. A Vraxi craftworker could not have done better with the tools you had." Roan had nothing to say to that, so he said nothing. "I want to ask you something," Vara said. The way she said it made clear she did not ask things often. "And I want an honest answer, not a diplomatic one, not the answer you think a queen should hear." "All right," Roan said. "Why did you repair it?" The command channel was open. Roan knew that Yult and probably half the station were listening. He did not change his answer for them. "It was broken," he said. "She was holding it like it mattered, so it mattered." Vara looked at him for a long time without speaking. "That is all," she said. "That is all." Another silence, longer this time. Vara turned her great head slightly, looking at something outside the frame of the transmission, and then turned back. "3 queens before me," she said slowly, "were brought a hatchling's cracked bond shard in the field. Each time, the hatchling was lost or too far to retrieve. Do you know what they did?" Roan shook his head. "They left the shard. They said it was already dying, that to grieve it was weakness." A pause. "They were not wrong by Vraxi reasoning. A broken bond cannot be repaired. That is known. A shard too far gone cannot reconnect. That is known. What you did is not possible by any method we have." "I used xenomineral adhesive and a resin compound meant for geological samples," Roan said. Something moved across Vara's face. He could not name it exactly. He thought it might have been the Vraxi equivalent of a person staring at something they could not quite believe. "You did not know it was a bond crystal," she said. "No, I found out after." "You repaired it before you knew what it was." "It was broken and she wouldn't let go of it. That was enough to know." The silence that followed was different from the others. It had weight. Vara spoke a word. The translator worked at it for a moment and then produced something uncertain, surrounded by question marks. It rendered as "worthy without debt." Then, after another attempt, "one who acts before the account is opened." "In our language," Vara said, "there is no word for what you are. We have words for allies, words for those who are owed things and those who owe them. We do not have a word for someone who gives without knowing there is anything to give to." She looked at Siv again. Siv made a sound, small and clear. Vara closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked at Roan with the full weight of whatever she was. "I am coming to your station," she said. "I will come alone. I ask that no weapons are pointed at me when I board." On the open channel, Roan heard Commander Yult make a sound that suggested he needed to sit down immediately. "All right," Roan said. "You agree quickly for someone who does not know me," Vara said. "You called your ships off and asked permission to come aboard," Roan said. "That tells me enough." The transmission ended. On the tray, Siv let out a long, slow breath and pressed herself flat in the way small creatures do when they have been holding themselves tense for too long and can finally stop. Roan sat back in his chair and stared at the blank screen for a moment. Then he got up, made himself a fresh cup of coffee, and waited. The docking bay had never been so clean. Roan noticed it when he walked through. Someone had removed every loose crate, wiped down the floor panels, and repositioned the lighting so there were no dark corners. Commander Yult stood near the bay entrance with 4 station security officers who were trying very hard to look relaxed and failing completely. Yult looked at Roan when he arrived. Then at the small hatchling sitting on Roan's left shoulder, tail wrapped once around his collar for balance. "You brought her," Yult said. "She would not stay on the tray," Roan said, "and I wasn't going to lock her in." Yult opened his mouth, and then closed it in the particular way of a man who had decided that some arguments were not worth the energy. The docking clamp engaged with a sound that moved through the floor. The bay pressure equalized. The outer door opened. Vara had to angle herself to fit through the corridor that led from the dock. The station's standard corridors were built for species up to about twice human height, and she exceeded that considerably. She moved without hurrying, her footfalls deliberate, her scarred head low and level. She had no escort, no weapons visible. She came alone exactly as she had said. Every person in the bay took one involuntary step back. Every person except Roan, who was watching Civ. The hatchling had gone rigid on his shoulder the moment the door opened. Her scales were cycling fast, blues and greens and a sharp bright gold that Roan had not seen before. She was making no sound. She was barely breathing. Vara stopped when she saw her. For a moment the two of them just looked at each other across the bay, the ancient queen and the hatchling who had been lost and was now found. Whatever passed between them in that moment was not something the translator could carry. It was not something words were built for. Roan felt it anyway, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, something large and important shifting into a new position. Civ launched herself off his shoulder. She crossed the bay in 3 beats of her small wings, wings Roan had not seen her use before, and hit Vara's chest and climbed immediately up to the ridge behind her jaw, tucking in under the edge of her scales in the particular way that small creatures fit themselves into the safest available space. Vara went very still, her eyes closed, her breathing slowed until it was barely visible. Nobody in the bay moved or spoke for nearly a full minute. Then Vara opened her eyes and looked at Roan. She walked to him. Up close she was even larger, her head level with his chest when she lowered it, her breath warm and carrying a faint mineral smell. She examined him the way a person examines something they have been thinking about for a long time and are finally seeing directly. "Come," she said, "I want to see where you worked." They walked to his lab with Yult and the security team trailing at a careful distance. Vara had to move through some sections sideways, but she did not comment on it. In the lab she looked at the work table, the tools still laid out from the night of the repair, the magnifier still positioned where he had left it. She bent her head and looked at the tools for a long time. "These are not crystal tools," she said. "No, they were what I had." "You used them anyway." "I had 4 hours and no alternatives, so yes." She straightened up and looked at him. "I am going to offer you something. I want you to hear it fully before you answer." Roan nodded. "A Vraxi Queen's debt bond," she said. "Given formally, witnessed by my warship commanders on the channel. It means I owe you 1 act of equal weight to what you gave me. For a queen of the Dominion, the weight of a returned hatchling and a restored bond is—" She paused as if searching for words that were large enough, considerable. Roan understood enough about interstellar politics to know what she was saying. A queen's debt bond in this region of space was not symbolic. It was one of the few currencies that crossed every political line, honored by every faction whether they liked the Vraxi or not, because the Vraxi enforced it absolutely. "I don't need anything," Roan said. Vara looked at him steadily. "I know, that is why I am offering it." Roan looked at his workbench, at the tools still lying where he had set them down in the middle of the night. "If I ever need it," he said slowly, "could I use it for someone else, not for myself?" Vara was quiet for a moment. "That is an unusual question." "I'm just asking." "Yes," she said. "A debt bond can be redirected. It is not common, but it is permitted." "Then I'll take it." In the corridor outside, he heard Das make a muffled sound that might have been disbelief, or might have been him sitting down very suddenly on the floor. Vara reached one careful claw toward the work table and touched the mineral resin compound Roan had used on the crystal, the one meant for geological samples. She looked at it for a moment. "My craft workers will want to know about this," she said. "I'll write up the method," Roan said. From her position under Vara's jaw ridge, Siv made a small, contented sound, the same sound she had made the night the crystal was repaired. Roan looked up at her. She looked back at him with gold eyes and blinked once, slow and deliberate. Outside the station, the three warships had moved off the outer marker. The channel was quiet. Yult appeared in the lab doorway, looking like a man who had started the day expecting paperwork and ended it holding something he did not have a form for. "I'll need to file a report," Yult said to nobody in particular. Nobody helped him with that. 2 weeks after Vara's visit, Outpost Nuren had more docked ships than it had ever held in its 12 years of operation. They overflowed the main bays and sat in the outer anchor points, vessels of 7 different registries from 4 different political factions, all of them here for the same reason. Not for Roan. He was very clear about that when people asked. He told anyone who would listen that he was a xenobiologist with unfinished fauna catalogs and a hatchling who had taken over his heated sample tray and showed no intention of leaving. He was not a diplomat. He did not want to be famous. He wanted to finish his work. The galaxy, largely, did not care what Roan wanted. The debt bond had been broadcast on the formal Vraxi channel the same day Vara left. By the following morning, every faction with interests near Vraxi border space had received the record of it. A human xenobiologist on a neutral research station held a Queen's debt bond. The implications of that moved through political offices, and command centers the way. A stone moves through still water outward in every direction at once. Commander Yult had filed 4 separate incident reports and was working on a 5th. Das had given 2 interviews to a Galric news service and seemed to be enjoying himself considerably more than Roan thought was appropriate. The request for mediation came on day 9. It arrived from 2 directions simultaneously: the Vraxi Dominion's border office and the Pelhari Compact's senior council, both asking if Outpost Nuren would host preliminary talks on the Sereth territorial dispute, a conflict that had been stalled for 6 years and had recently come close to becoming something worse than stalled. They both cited the same reason. The station was perceived as a place of unusual trust. Yult brought the request to Roan personally. Roan read it twice, put it down, and said he was not a diplomat. Yult said he knew that. Roan said he had no training in interstellar mediation. Yult said he was aware of that too. Roan said that asking a xenobiologist to mediate a 6-year territorial dispute was not a reasonable thing to do. Yult said that was probably true, and that if Roan had a better candidate available, he was very open to suggestions. Roan did not have one, he agreed. The talks began on day 12. A Vraxi delegation of 3 and a Pelhari delegation of 4, seated across a table in the station's largest meeting room, which had been hastily repainted and supplied with chairs that fit 4 different body configurations. Roan sat at the head of the table with a translation unit and a notepad and the private feeling of a man who had made a significant error in judgment. The first 2 hours were not productive. The Pelhari lead diplomat, a large gray-skinned being named Orvath, spoke in long formal sentences that the translator labored over. The Vraxi representative, a younger male named Set who had clearly been told to be respectful and was finding it difficult, responded in short sentences that needed no translation to understand or short because he was restraining the longer ones. Roan took notes and said very little. He asked clarifying questions when the language became too layered to follow. He did not take sides. He did not perform. He mostly listened, which was the thing he was best at and which seemed to surprise both delegations in different ways. It was going poorly, but not catastrophically when the door opened. Siv came in. She had learned the door mechanism 4 days ago and had been using it to move freely around the station ever since, to the varying reactions of the personnel she encountered. She walked into the meeting room, looked around at the assembled diplomats with the frank curiosity of a creature that had not yet learned to be intimidated by anything, and jumped up onto the table. She walked its full length. Orvath watched her approach with the stillness of someone who was not sure what the correct response was. Civ stopped in front of him, looked directly into his face, yawned a wide, unimpressed, deeply unsophisticated yawn that showed every small tooth, and then lay down on the table in front of him with her tail curled over her nose. The room was silent. Then Orvath, slowly, made a sound, low and rumbling, starting in his chest and working outward. It took Roan a moment to identify it because he had not heard it from a Pelhari before. It was a laugh. It was a real one, not a diplomatic laugh, not a polite one. The kind that comes out when something catches a person entirely off guard and bypasses every layer of professional composure they have built. He reached out one large gray hand and very gently touched the top of Civ's head with one finger. Civ did not move. She was already asleep. Set, the Vraxi representative, looked at Orvath. Orvath looked at Set. Between them on the table, a hatchling snored. Something changed in the room. It did not fix 6 years of disputed territory. It did not resolve the underlying resource claims or the border arguments or the accumulated distrust. But it broke something open that had been sealed shut, and once something is open, it can be worked with. The talks continued for 4 more days. They reached a preliminary framework, not a resolution, but a structure to build one on. Both sides agreed to a second session. Both sides left without incident. Roan wrote his notes into the official record, submitted them to Yult, and went back to his lab. The fauna catalogs were 3 weeks behind. The mineral samples from the gas giant had not been touched. He sat down at his workbench, pulled up his files, and started working. The debt bond document from Vara sat in a locked folder on his terminal. He had not opened it since the day he received it. He did not feel the need to. A message arrived from Vara that evening. One line, as was apparently her preference. She has chosen her den. This is permitted. Roan looked at Civ, who was asleep on the heated sample tray with the bond crystal held loose in her claws, its light pulsing in slow and steady time. He looked back at his work. Outside, the gas giant turned in the dark the way it always had, indifferent and immense. Ships came and went from the station that had become, without asking to be, a place where things were repaired. Nobody asked Roan how it had happened. They probably would not have understood his answer anyway. He had just held out an open hand. That was all. That was the whole of it.